So I thought that I would, ask some questions during the question period too, to bring things out about Denis and his work. Since I can't do that, I'm going to do it now, and I'm going to talk a bit about Denis' place in France right now and the way the French think and talk about the United States, and why I'm particularly happy that his book on religion in America has now been published in English. Anyone who lives in France, for any American who lives in France for any period of time, will learn how ignorant in general the French are about the United States. Now that's true of every country you go to. There's no reason why they should know as much about your country as you do. Even if that country plays a big role in l'imaginaire of the country. But more striking to me is the lack of curiosity about the United States and France. I mean, real curiosity. The curiosity you have when you open the hood of a car, you just want to figure out, how does it work? How does this thing actually work? And that's rare. I mean, I think it's striking to me just to compare young people, young French people to young Germans or Italians or French. In general, Germans, Italians, and French visit the United States at an early age. It's part of their, part of their ticket they have to punch to come to the States, get on a Greyhound bus, cross the country. Especially the Germans they will go to any black church anywhere to have a real American experience. And they have to go through Texas, they have to do all of that, because to be a German means you have to understand America. That's part of what it is to understand yourself and the times. And their English is excellent. The Germans and the Dutch speak better English than we do. The French do not speak French well, young French people. They don't spend a lot of time with American television. It's getting better because of the internet. But in general, there's just a striking lack of curiosity about the United States. And I think that it's given rise to both a strange strain of anti-Americanism, about which Denis has written, but also strange forms of pro-Americanism that are the product of a fantasy as well. You remember the line from Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. Pray don't talk to me about the weather, Mr. Worthington. Whenever people talk to me about the weather, I always feel quite certain they mean something else. And that makes me so nervous. Well, I feel the same way when the French talk about the United States. I feel that when they're talking about the US, they're really talking about something else, and not about real existing America. And I think there's something good about that, or it's been good for me. I lived in Paris. I've been in Paris, various periods of my life, but I was there between 1988 and 1990. So I was there for the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I was also there for the Bicentenaire. And it was an extraordinary moment for thinking about America. It was François Thierry's moment in French intellectual culture. It did indeed seem that a 200-year history had come to an end, that a certain democratic drama that had pitted two revolutions against each other in the 18th century had come to an end, with one model being dominant and the other having failed. We saw the end of an illusion in his terms, and the rise of this problematic about democracy. And around Thierry, and around magazines like Le Débat and Esprit, you saw develop a kind of doctrine about politics in which the US played a crucial role. With Marcel Gauchet and Pierre Menon, there you would get an apocalyptic picture of the rise of modern democracy and individualism. On the other extreme, you had people like Gilles Lipovetsky and Philippe Prénom, who had a more lighthearted take on American popular culture, changes in fashion, the weird little things we do, anti-smoking legislation. It's just odd things that democracies do, and especially in the United States. And I have to say that that was very instructive for me to see the US from outside in that way, and through a particular lens. But the further away I get, the more I can see that everything revolved around a single theme, which was an amalgam of Tocqueville, Louis Dumont, and Coget. That there was this world historical drama that had taken place, that landed France in a certain position, and by reading America, you were able to read the tea leaves of the future. That's essentially how things worked when I was there, at least. And it was good to get away from a kind of more provincial view of the US and getting excited about the things people were excited about back then, like political correctness and the rest. Well, the Tocqueville drum is still being beaten in France. And I'm more and more surprised by how my friends who've been writing these things, how incurious they remain about the States. Probably the most obvious thing. To understand America, you've got to watch American TV. That America reads itself through American television. They don't even own TVs to begin with. And they're unwilling to get their fingers dirty, to pay attention, to swim in the strange pond that is America. And the more I read their works and think about them, thought about them, the more I've come to appreciate the books of Denis Lacorne. He is, for me, one of the rarest of birds in France, someone who's genuinely curious and open-minded about the US, speaks colloquial American English, and has spent a lot of time here just observing. When Denis talks about the weather, he's talking about the weather. And when he talks about the US, he's actually talking about the US. Still, there's a difference. When you read Denis' books, you do get a take on us that is unusual. There's a way in which particularly American historians all talk to each other about the same things. You get a sense of distance and perspective in what he writes. Denis has learned from Tocqueville. Tocqueville plays a role in the latest book, but he doesn't stop there. His books seem to do two things simultaneously. On the one hand, he lectures the French about the way things really are here. And on the other hand, he tells us what we look like from the outside. As I said on the blurb to the latest book, and I meant it, Denis seems sometimes to understand us better than we understand ourselves. Now, an example of this is the book that I feel I know the best, and that's La crise de l'identité américaine. Let me say a couple words about that before turning over the floor, and what makes that book special, give you a sense of what's special about these books and their author. La Crise was published in 1997, and it was, I'm guessing, conceived not only as a book about the US, but as an intervention in current French debates about multiculturalism, in which the US example was being used and misused. It was a time when many people were praising the United States, saying, why can't France, if the US can do it, why can't we be as multicultural as they are? Others, on the other hand, were using the image of the United States to scare others, to say that our multiculturalism was eroding our sense of citizenship, and if that's what we wanted, it meant the end of French republicanism. In all of this, there wasn't much, people weren't paying attention to the strange paradoxes and the nature of American multiculturalism and the tensions within the United States and in American history about these questions. In response, Denis suggested that multiculturalism is a unique, that the American experience with it is unique to the United States and in the way it conceives itself as a regime. And it goes to the heart of national identity, national identity, and also the contradictions in our identity. It points to two strains in American political culture that begin rising even before the American founding. On the one hand, the tradition of tolerance, especially tolerance of religion in the early colonies. That, though, very quickly led to a reaction, and mainly over the question of assimilation. If America was a new kind of regime, then at some level everyone had to be with the program. And that meant perhaps not only intellectually, but also culturally. And these two sides of the debate, and two different understandings of what America was about, that kept returning that tension at the end of the 19th and early 20th century with the waves of immigration and now today. The tension between being a civic nation and an ethnic nation is at the heart of what it is to be America. The point was to say there is no American model that the French can argue about, a single American model that they can hold up as something that's attractive or frightening. Rather, the United States is a contest between two principles having to do with the split in our own minds. And he looks at both of these in this book with sympathy. He understands what each of them try to achieve, but also their limitations. And in so doing, reminded the French just how complicated these questions are on the one hand. On the other, that the French problem is another problem. And that it was time perhaps to stop talking about the American example and to pay more attention to the real challenges posed by immigration and tolerance in France today. For me, it was just an eye-opening book about the US and also about French debates indirectly. Well, in his recent book, Religion in America, he's done it again. I'm not going to say much about it. He's going to talk about it. But again, I see it as a very interesting intervention. There's another crisis in republicanism now having to do with Islam in France. And again, the US is being held up as a model and as an anti-model. And again, it's based on ignorance. There's an assumption in France that the Protestant heritage is at war with the Enlightenment, that a religious principle, the Protestant one here, is at war with a secular one, being the Enlightenment, and the two can never meet or mix. And Denis shows in a brilliant way that this just is not the case, that both of these strains are present in our thinking and in our nature as Americans. Again, he's written an enlightening book, and again, he's managed to square the circle. Buy the book, read the book, and now listen to the man.
I'll just say we're sneaking up here because of this menage. My name's Alfred Stephan. I'm thrilled that Denis here, and because you said something very interesting. It's about friendship, and it's about one thing is that in this institution building, Denis was really the first, along with Charles Taylor, distinguished scholar in residence that we had, and he created the model of what you should be when you're a distinguished professor in residence. Open to the students, open to the faculty, doing major work, a delight to have here, and helped out on all sorts of things. And he attended, I think, a lot of my course. So he ended up co-teaching many of the students who were there. So it was the best possible type of aligned scholarship, fellowship. And the question about, we now have 14 books in our series. This is one of the absolute first ones. This is the first one accepted and gave the whole series some credibility with Columbia University Press, and I thank you for that. And it's interesting, the question of friendship and respect. I asked Tony Judd to write a preface to this. He said he would. I then, when I heard he was dying, I wrote a a note saying, look, I know you can't and don't feel under any responsibility to write down. 4 days after Tony died, the preface arrived. It obviously was one of the things that he did in the last 2 days of his life, because that's the respect that he has for our speaker and the project.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's difficult to start after so many flattering comments, but I'm very grateful for Al, who invited me here and convinced me that the book should come out in English, and for Mark's comments, which are based not just on this book, but previous books as well, and that was wonderful on his part. And also, I'm glad you invoked Tony Judd. It was an unexpected gift. I thought that he would not write a preface, and to my great surprise, it had been done. And so I'm grateful to all of you. It's a wonderful way to introduce the topic. So let me directly talk about other tensions than the one evoked by Mark Lilla. Tensions between, that's going to be the first part of my talk, are early narratives of the American national identity, and competing narratives of the American identity. And then secondly, look at the revival of those narratives of the American identity in the 20th and 21st century. So whenever I came back to the United States, it's always, and that's pretty often, that's 2 or 3 times a year, but it's always surprising for me to see how prevalent is religion in America, in politics. Last summer, I was in California. There was much talk about Governor Perry's day of prayer in Texas called The Response, in which, at the time, he hadn't decided that we would run for the primaries, and a day of prayer in which the future candidate declared, quote, his love for the living Christ. A day of prayer which, by definition, could not make a non-Christian or even a Catholic terribly comfortable, but that's Texas for you. And as a French political scientist who's written on the origin of the American Republic, actually at the time of the bicentennial that was evoked by Mark Lilla, and looked at the affinities between French and American political thought in the 18th century. I even wrote once an article called The Trade of Republican Ideas between France and the United States. It's always difficult coming from France to explain this exuberant religiosity in the United States and to reconcile it with what is for me an undeniable reality, namely the secular foundation of the American government. A secular foundation, which, by the way, was greatly admired by the French, and to a certain extent by a number of British observers at the same time. So the challenge then is to explain the coexistence of what I call those two radically different trends. A religious tradition that invites American politicians to talk openly about their own faith, incites them to defend and promote religious ideas or symbols in the public square. And on the other, another tradition that insists on the necessity to preserve the separation of church and state. And there's an obvious clash between, let's say, openly religious Republicans and more secular, less obviously religious Democrats. Of course, that wasn't always the case. That has a lot to do with the Southern strategy of the Republican Party, which is really something that emerged in the 60s, particularly reached a climax under Carter's administration. So the book is an attempt to explain competing values and to place those values in a long historical perspective and also in a comparative perspective. What matters for me is not religion as an isolated phenomenon, but the uses of religion by political elites and by intellectuals in order to create or reinvent a national identity. And national identities are always difficult to define because they are at the center of historical controversies, rival discourses, narratives, inventions, reconstructions, and so on. And there's an added difficulty in the United States because the chronology of events is very different from that of Europe. perhaps with the exception of Germany. That is to say, and I think the historian John Muren put it beautifully. He says the following: in the United States, the constitutional roof was built before national walls. The revolution created a political system, a political regime, but it took over a century and civil war to solidify the national walls. And so the starting point of the argument is, from a European perspective, there's not one narrative, but at least two rival narratives of American identity. First one, or I would call it a creation story, if you wish, of a secular republic, which had a lot in common with the French Republic, or the French Republican tradition, and which promotes key principles with which you're quite familiar, with the idea of equality, the idea of sovereignty of the people, the idea of separation of church and state, so on and so forth. The idea that a republic is by definition opposed to a monarchy, that is to say there is no divine right power, there is no established church, and those are very important things which are visible, the minute you read the Declaration of Independence. That's what it's all about. A republic which can be secular, hence the unpopular notion defended by some American historian. I think of my friend Isaac Kramnik, who wrote this important book called The Godless Constitution. It's about the American Constitution. And then the second narrative, which I call neo-Puritan or romantic, and I'll explain why, is really something which became fashionable a little later, in the beginning of the 19th century, and which in fact denies the secular nature of the American government and gives tremendous importance, not so much to the founding fathers who are forgotten, but to the Pilgrims and to the Puritans. It's another creation story which was reinvented early in New England, but reinvented at the national level in the 19th century by a number of historians, and the most prominent of them being George Bancroft, with his famous 10-volume history of the United States. The first volume was published in 1834, 1 year before Tocqueville's Democracy in America, 1834, Bancroft, 1835, first volume of Tocqueville. So let me start with the secular narrative, first one, which emphasizes separation of church and state and toleration. It's of course not an American invention. I mean, you can read John Locke about it, find early element of separation. You can read Roger Williams even, also. But what's interesting for me, coming from France, is the way Enlightenment philosophers discuss the Puritans in general and in North America. And usually, Enlightenment philosophers saw the Puritans as zealots, as dangerous fanatics, including John Locke. John Locke, for instance, in the letter Toleration, attacks the Calvinists for having used, I cite John Locke, bloody violence for the execution of Michel Servet, who was burnt in Geneva in 1553. Voltaire is another very good example of a philosopher who finds religion in general dangerous because they sooner or later lead to fanaticism. And in his, for instance, Examen de Milan-Bolingbroke, Voltaire denounces the stupidity of fanaticism and of old Christian millenarians that he called Christicoles, and who, I cite Voltaire, literally accept the book of Revelation and made, quote, the demented prediction that a new Jerusalem would descend upon the earth. The result of such fanaticism was that Europe was drowned in an ocean of blood. Another quote from Voltaire. So you have numerous evidence that the Puritans are not liked in Europe. There's the article Puritain in Diderot's Encyclopedia, which is very critical. There's Abbé Raynal's famous History of the Two Indies, which was republished many times in Europe and in France around 1780. And a very influential book about the colonization of the Americas and of North America, reprinted many times. And Raynal, when he talks about the Puritan settlers, what does he say? Well, on the one hand, they accomplished great things, he admits, but very quickly he says that, well, their success was partly due to the help of local Indians, the welcoming presence, as he puts it, of a few savages, and yet, and he's very disturbed by that, a couple of years later, actually, it's nearly a century later, Captain John Lovewell will murder a group of Indians near Boston, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, I think. And so Raynal concludes his section on the Puritans with the following question. Were you Christians? No. You were monsters of extermination, end quote. And he sees the Puritans as a variant of a modern variant of the conquistadors. That's the way in Europe we talk about Puritanism. And this harsh criticism of American religious excesses, of course, doesn't imply that religion was rejected in general. And again, if you come back to Voltaire, there's a major exception for Voltaire and a number of French philosophers, and that's the Quakerism. Quakerism for secular Frenchmen is an ideal utopian religion. It's a religion for a non-religious age. And what fascinates Voltaire is that in Quakerism you have a religion, a government without priests, without sacrament, without communion, an anti-Catholicism, if you wish. And he praises that type of religion. And it started a tradition. All the French visitors who go to North America will come with Voltaire in their pocket, will try to meet Quakers in Philadelphia, and some will be enthusiastic about what they see, others will be disappointed depending on the time when they visit. But basically, let me come back then to this first secular narrative of American identity. I think it's really at the heart of a very important dialogue. We've forgotten how important it was, that took place between the successor of Diderot's Encyclopédia Démonier, who published the Encyclopédie Méthodique in between 1784 and 1786. Actually, it's an American, Franco-American dialogue that involved Démonier on one side, with his new encyclopedia, 14 articles on the United States, one per state plus one on les États-Unis, and Madison, Jefferson on the other side, and with a great fascination for Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom, which was, you probably know, drafted early in 1777, but did not become law in Virginia until 1786, thanks to the very active lobbying of Madison. And it's a law that purpose of the law was to disestablish the Anglican Church, to abolish all religious oaths of allegiance, to make sure that no tax is collected for a church or for a school, a religious school. That bill was immediately translated. The year it came out, it was translated to French, published that same year in Desmonier's Encyclopedia, full translation, and was discussed 3 years before the French Revolution. There was a discussion about the importance of the separation of church and state in Virginia, and Virginia was presented as kind of a universal model for a revolution to come and a secularism to come. And Desmonniers, by the way, very interesting person, he was the secretary of Monsieur. Monsieur is the name of Louis XVI's brother, and he was a lawyer by training, and he's one of the few who survived the French Revolution. He was an immigrant, he lived in the United States for a number of years before he went back to France, and then I think worked, was in a consulate or was an elected official under Napoleon later. So besides this Franco-American dialogue, you find the same interesting dialogue between radical Whigs in Britain and American founders. And I'll give you one example. I mean, you all know about Tom Paine, but less well known is the case of James Burke. James Burke is a radical Whig, the author of a book called Crito. It's a 2-volume of essays. And volume 2 of Crito, that's published in 1767, is dedicated, quote, to the good people of Britain of the 20th century. So it's a utopia for a future age. And by the way, it's a classic thing to do when you write a utopia. That's one way for you to criticize a government without being penalized for criticizing the monarchy, because you place that in a distant future. And in fact, it's a deconstruction, systematic deconstruction of the British monarchy. And Berg invents the phrase wall of separation in that book, the second one, and he attacks, for instance, the mixed, mongrel, spiritual, temporal, secular, ecclesiastical establishment of the monarchy and asked for privatization of all church functions. He calls for the abolition of the Test Act, which will not be abolished in Britain until, if I'm not mistaken, 1839, and asked the good people of Britain of the 20th century to, quote, build an impenetrable wall of separation between things sacred and civil. Now we know, and Dreisbach, who's a very good legal historian, has demonstrated that, in fact, Trito had been read by Jefferson, that Jefferson owned the work of Ginsburg and probably found his inspiration for the famous Jefferson letter to the Baptist community of Danbury, probably found his inspiration in Ginsburg. So now let me consider the second Neo-Puritan narrative of American identity, which I call Neo-Puritan or Romantic. Let me explain what I mean by that. Now, in the 19th century, of course, the consensus among intellectuals that the French Revolution has failed with the terror and has ended in a disaster. And it's a time, and that's why I call it romantic, when tradition, religious values, religious emotions are being rediscovered and praised, and also there's a passion for medieval studies, quote unquote, ancestors, great ancestors, even a pre-medieval past, and the Gauls, the Saxons, the Germanic tribes of Germany, of course, are all praised and honored. And there's a new historical or historiographic fashion that develops, and it's really the idea that in order to understand a national identity, you have to consider, to identify the character of a people, or the spirit of a people. And that's what Bancroft says. It's also what Tocqueville says. For instance, when he says, a typical example of this historiography, he says, quote, in Democracy in America, the character of a nation is contained in its origin. Here's the quote. In a manner of speaking, says Tocqueville, the whole man already lies swaddled in his cradle. And that's a very interesting chapter 2 of Democracy in America, which is entitled On the Point of Departure and Its Importance for the Future of Anglo-Americans. So, character, the spirit of a nation, that's where it starts. And the German would say the Volksgeist, it's the same, that has the same meaning, and it's to be found in a founding people. And that's at the heart of a romantic imagination. Think of Herder, think of the Schlegel brothers, think of Fichte. In France, think of Guizot. In the United States, think of John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster, and of course, George Bancroft. And never forget that George Bancroft, who was a kind of boy genius, he graduated from Harvard at age 14, then was sent to Germany from 1818 to 1822. He studied at Göttingen, he studied at Berlin, Weimar. He took courses from Planck on church history, courses from Weckler and Tacitus, the one who rediscovered the importance of Germania and the Germanic tribes who supposedly had a taste for liberty and freedom. He studied theology with Schleiermacher, history with Herer, who was a disciple of Herder, and so on and so forth. So in the United States, if you look at the origin and raise the question, who represents best the spirit of the American people, the Volksgeist of the American people? It's a difficult question indeed, because Tocqueville and Bancroft admit that the colonization started in Virginia, not in New England. But Virginia is not a good case. The motivation was not religious. Those people who came to Virginia were gold diggers and not honorable, according to Tocqueville. They were unscrupulous and undisciplined men. And if you bracket out American Indians, well, you're left with the New England, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And I would argue that Bancroft did for America what Tacitus had done for the Germans. He would rehabilitate the Pilgrims, mocked and denigrated by Enlightenment philosophers, and I should add, superbly ignored by the Founding Fathers. There's not a single reference to the Puritans in the Federalist Papers, for instance. For them, it's an archaic age, and there's no point in talking about it. So Bancroft marks the triumph of New England historiography. And Bancroft's argument really is that the character of the Pilgrim shaped the new American nationality. And the climax, of course, of that narrative, that's the Mayflower Cabin, where I cite Bancroft. humanity recovers its rights and the birth of constitutional liberty takes place. Now, it's a new narrative which you find developed in almost exactly the same term in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, that's published 1 year after Bancroft. And clearly one knew the other or had read the other's manuscript. I mean, this was the age. And it's also a providential conception of American history. This idea that you have a kind of marvelous continuity from Luther and Calvin to the Puritans of New England, with an improved notion of liberty that develops and pops out as a modern republic. And quote from Bancroft, "The Puritans planted on the soil of a virgin country, quote, the seminal principles of republican freedom and independence," end quote. And Tocqueville would say very much the same, looking at the Mayflower Compact that he cites, but without the references to the king and loyalty to the king, which would give it a less republican appearance. So Tocqueville's quote is kind of tactical, and he compares that to, it's almost like a genuine social contract, says Tocqueville in a note that was discovered recently, social contract in the lines dreamt by Rousseau. Now, of course, there are a number of modern historians, specialists of the New England history today, that have questioned the centrality of the Mayflower Compact, which in fact was very much an act of circumstance designed to prevent a near mutiny aboard the Mayflower. But we can go into detail there. So basically, what we have is advocates of this neo-Puritan narrative that will work very hard to create a new cult of ancestors, symbolizing the genius of the American people. And Bancroft will say at the end of volume 1 of the history of the United States, he will talk about the sublimity of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. And at this stage, I would say the Pilgrims really displace the founding fathers. Now, let me examine, I'm going to skip the part that's about the 19th century, early 20th century in my book, and let's examine what I call, and that's the second half of my talk, the revival of both the secular narrative on the one hand and the neo-Puritan narrative in the late 20th century, 21st century. Now, in the 20th century, the secular narrative, which was defended by Jefferson and others, was really rediscovered by progressive justices of the Supreme Court. And I would argue that this paradigm still works more or less today in the Supreme Court, despite numerous attempts to break down the wall of separation between church and state. And the classic decision, the Everson decision of 1947, the best illustration of this revival, and for two reasons, because number one, it applies the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to all the states through the indoctrination, through the doctrine of incorporation. And secondly, it is based on a very interesting historical research methodology, a rereading of Jefferson's letter to the Baptist of Danbury. And it's a decision where Justice Black concludes his opinion with the following words: "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be high and impregnable. We would not accept the slightest breach," end quote. Now, the reality may be different. In fact, if you look carefully at that opinion, which is about the financing, public financing of transportation of students due to Catholic schools, in fact, the opinion was that this was not a contradiction, that was not invalidated by the Establishment Clause. But that's besides the point. What's interesting is the rediscovery of the metaphor by Justice Black. And why is that so? And again, as an historian, if you look at the way he proceeds, what's fascinating is that he uses case law, and there are not too many early cases that deal with religious free exercise or Establishment Clause. The one case that's important for Justice Black is the Reynolds decision of 1879, a decision about a federal law that criminalized polygamy at the time when the Mormons were still in territory and were trying to preserve that tradition of polygamy. And the court's decision was that, well, no, polygamy is not acceptable. What's interesting is that that other case, Reynolds, was written by Justice Waite, And why was Wade, the wonderful annex in this case, where you find the full text of the Bill on Religious Freedom written by Jefferson, Madison's writings, the famous letter to the Danbury Baptist community. So the key question from a historical viewpoint, why this passion for late 18th century texts that had been forgotten? And the response, which is suggested by Dreisbach, is the following. It happened that Wade lived in a neighborhood that was such in Washington, D.C. His neighbor, in fact, was George Bancroft. And George Bancroft fed him with old historical documents that had been printed, or not printed, but rediscovered. And so gave him that information. And in fact, we know that because Wade thanked his famous neighbor for the transmission of, quote, historical facts that help him decide the case. So today, I would argue that the true guardians of the wall of separation between church and state are federal judges and justices of the Supreme Court, especially progressive justices. But of course, the jurisprudence has evolved, and you have what I would call separatists on one hand. Lawyers prefer to call them separationists, and anti-separatists. I'm not going to go into detail here, but basically what's the viewpoint of the separatists is that we have a number of classic decisions. The ban on school prayers from public school, the ban on the display of Christmas nativity scene in the public square, the ban on the display of the Ten Commandments in the courthouse or in classrooms. All of those, some of which are quite recent decisions, demonstrate a commitment to the separation of church and state. And the key reasoning often involved there is principle of government neutrality, and the idea that, which is often cited, I'll take Justice Souter, for instance, in a recent case, but it's an opinion that he cites, and it's often cited, and it's originally an opinion by Justice O'Connor, which is that a religious display, whatever its nature, whether it's a cross, prayer, tablets with the Ten Commandments, those religious displays cannot be tolerated in the public space if, quote, they send the message to non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members. Which means what? It means that there's no preferred religion in the United States, or for that matter, no predominant religion in the United States. Citizenship is perceived as all-inclusive, and every religious faith has its place, including pagan religion, including Santeria, a famous decision by the Supreme Court called the Church of the Lukumi Babalupai, which tolerates animal sacrifices in Florida, even though that violates a local ordinance that prohibits cruelty to animals. So basically, every religion is respectable, and non-religion is also respectable. And then let's examine the revival of the neo-Puritan narrative. I would say revival in the courts, in political science, and in mainstream politics. In the courts, that revival, you find it with conservative justices, for instance, late Justice Rehnquist, and today probably Justice Thomas and Scalia. And their position really is that of an anti-separatist. They don't believe in the wall of separation, and they'd rather get rid of the Jefferson's metaphor. In that position, the United States is a Christian nation, or at least a nation that is built on Christian principles. And the founding fathers, despite historical evidence, I would argue, are no different from the Pilgrims. They believe in God, they were motivated by Christian principle, they believe in a Christianized political morality. And Rehnquist, for instance, writes that the wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor which has proved useless as a guide for judging, that should be frankly abandoned. That's in Wallace versus Jaffrey. And like most separatists, Rehnquist kind of collapsed American history in a very strange way. And a wonderful quote from him from a decision that the school district of Binghamton, 1963. Here's what he writes. Strange way of writing history. Quote, "The fact that the founding fathers believed devotedly that there was a God and the rights of man were rooted in him is clearly evidenced in their writings from the Mayflower Compact to the Constitution itself, end quote. So as if it's collapsing many, many years of American history into one, as if Protestant thinking and Enlightenment thought were one and the same, as if the jealous God of the Old Testament was the same thing as the creator of the Declaration of Independence. But remember that the God of the Declaration of Independence is not a jealous God. Walter Burns has shown that beautifully in a book called Making Patriots. The creator there gives rights, but then disappears. He doesn't condemn, he doesn't punish. He's not an Old Testament God. It's the sovereign people who have rights, defend their rights, and make and redefine them. What kind of God? Well, who knows and who cares? Since in a Republican form of government can be without God. Hence Jefferson's famous sentences in Notes in Virginia, which was translated to French and widely read in France as well, Observation sur la Virginie, and said the following, quote, "It does me no injury to say there are 20 gods or no God, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." And remember that Jefferson, in his spare time, is elected president. What does he do? He cuts and pastes. He takes the Gospels, rewrites the Gospels in something which will become known as the Jefferson Bible, and it cuts out everything that has to do with miracles, with the resurrection, and the end of the Jefferson Bible is the following, quote, "And Joseph rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed," end of Jefferson's Bible, which was published very late in 1895, and republished by the Congress in 1904. At that time, the Congress would give a free copy of Jefferson's Bible to every new elected member of the Congress. I'm afraid that's not being done today. Now, in political science, the example of the revival of this narrative, you find that a good example is in the late work of Professor Samuel Huntington in a book called Who Are We?, and which is really about the American identity, subtitled The Challenges to America's National Identity. It's a book that came out in 2004. And very much like Wenquist, Huntington refuses to make a clear-cut distinction between Puritan history and the period of founding fathers. For him, it's in a way, it's one and the same, which is a way of diminishing the importance of the founding fathers and increasing the importance of the Puritan experience in a good Tocquevillian fashion, I would say. This is why, for instance, Huntington argues that, quote, "The American creed is the unique creation of descending Protestant culture," or that he admits that the creed has some element of an Enlightenment culture, but immediately adds, those ideas found receptive ground in the Anglo-Protestant culture that had already existed in America for over a century, and concludes, quote, "Religion has been and still is central, perhaps the central element of American identity." And that's why, by the way, when he looks at Hispanics, the immigration, the new migrant, the new Latinos, for him, their values do not fit the American creed. They cannot be assimilated. They are not compatible with the American creed. In fact, that has been challenged by Fukuyama, for instance. A wonderful article Fukuyama wrote about Huntington's book, and Fukuyama's point, where's the Protestant ethic today? It's probably the immigrant worker who works much harder than natives, and that's where you find the real Protestant ethic, work ethic. But also, I think Huntington forgot how difficult, was the integration of Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics in the United States, and that's why I have a chapter on the Bible Wars, and the point of the chapter on the Bible Wars in the 19th century is to show that we've forgotten how violent, how disruptive, how vicious was the conflict between Protestant elites and Catholic elites and migrants in the 19th century, and it took quite a while for them to be really assimilated. And thirdly, revival of the Neo-Puritan narrative, of course, you find it in today's primaries, in Michelle Bachmann's statement, in Governor Perry's statement about the importance of Christianity, It's not a new phenomenon. Huckabee, when he was a candidate in 2008, said in one of the primaries that he wanted to Christianize the Constitution in rewriting the preamble of the Constitution. So, and there are interesting things that are taking place. For instance, Jeff Rosen recently showed in a very interesting article that the influence of Willard Cleon Scarcer's strange book, The 5,000 Leap, 20 Great Ideas That Changed the World. That book was published in 1981, and that book is been popularized by Glenn Beck on his so-called university, which you could see on Fox News for quite a while, Friday night, and is a key source of information for seminars that are being offered today in Washington, D.C. Seminars offered by the National Center for Constitutional Studies, which are tendered by elected members of the Congress and staff members of the Congress. And the point of the seminars is to demonstrate the Christian nature of the American government. Now, for his demonstration, Scarcer uses an argument which is, I would call Herderian, referring to Herder, the Romantic author in Germany. He advocates, for instance, a return to Saxon liberties. He praises the superiority of Anglo-Saxon thought. And it's like reading Bancroft again, but a very simplified, simplistic Bancroft written again, a kind of providential reading of American history with an implicit hierarchy of races. But let me go further. I believe that the revival of the Neo-Puritan narrative has a lot to do with the Southern strategy of the Republican Party, which reached really a climax under the Carter's administration at a time when if you look at the source, the origin of the moral majority, which will help Reagan's election, and you look at the key organizers, not so much Falwell, but the organizers around him, the key struggle at the time had a lot to do with the Christian academies. Now, the Christian academies were private schools that were developed in the South to resist the desegregation that had been inaugurated by legal decision, but also by the Civil Rights Act. And Carter had made it clear that he would continue to, that Christian academies would not be free of tax. And it's at this point that the fundamentalist right, which was not politically organized, became really organized and became the moral majority. And so once evangelicals, or conservative evangelicals, were given a prominent place in the Republican Party, well, it was clear that religious values, traditional family values would become central to the platform of the Grand Old Party. Transformation, of course, with huge electoral consequences, and that would give a prominent place to what I call the revival of the Neo-Puritan paradigm in the party and in the Tea Party movement today. So let me conclude now. Looking back again at French perception of religion in America and why they've changed over the years. And Mark Lilla said very, very nicely that there's kind of lack of curiosity about the United States and France, more today than in the 18th century, by the way, surprisingly. I mean, there's less distance between the continents and yet we seem to not understand the United States as well as we did in the 18th century. And I think part of the problem is the inability of the French to understand evangelicalism, as if the first and the second Great Revival had never existed. Part of the reason is not that France is not a secular society, but I think it has preserved a very strong Catholic culture in a secular environment. And this Catholic culture is based on respect for order, hierarchy, discipline, based on fear of openly expressed religious emotions, fear also of religious competition, fear of religious entrepreneurship, which makes it very difficult for French commentators to explain the rise of evangelical values. It's not a new phenomenon. Take Tocqueville. Tocqueville, who had a nice abstract concept of the Puritan age, had a real problem dealing with evangelicals. He attended a number of camp meetings in the 19th century, and that's described not in Democracy in America, but in other texts, And we know that and when Tocqueville describes a camp meeting, he writes like Trollope. And he expresses a real fear about the future of the American democracy, fear based on a dual threat, a fear of skepticism on the one hand that could lead to socialism. That's bad, atheist people. But fear of also what he calls a spiritualisme exalté, an undisciplined religion that could lead to anarchy. And so he deplores that. He deplores a kind of religiosity, as cites Tocqueville, that reduced men to the position of brutes, end quote, in sect in America. And then he has a solution, which is a kind of modernized Catholic church that could be the best church for America, he says. The only French thinker who had a positive view of evangelicalism is Michel Chevalier, a student of, in fact, Saint-Simon, an economist, and he came to America, and his letters were published 2 years after Tocqueville, 1836, but it's not as well known, Lettres sur l'Amérique du Nord. And he was very much impressed by camp meetings. And why? Because the important place that was given to women, because he notes that, after all, women are not political participants. They are not involved in daily politics. They don't vote. But they are very much present at all the levels, in the hierarchy of the evangelical sects that he can observe. And he concludes that, looking at their full participants in Methodist and Baptist revivals, and he concludes that, well, that's probably where real democracy is at work, in religious meetings. Now, today, the very recent French perceptions are the following. I'm afraid that when we do not understand American politics, we use the easy stereotype, the easy reflection that, and they're all Puritans, no wonder they do this or that. And that stereotype is so well entrenched that by 1945, for instance, when Sartre visits the United States and Simone de Beauvoir, not together, but one after the other, they come up with the same reflection that indeed young Americans are incredibly Puritan, and they both even claim that they're Puritan in the sect